Staten Island in the summer of 1982 was not a place anyone expected national attention to land on. It was the outer borough, the one New Yorkers joked about, quiet residential streets giving way to marshland and creek beds, where the city's edges simply dissolved into water and weeds, a landscape of vacant lots and tidal inlets that most of the city never bothered to think about at all. And it was in one of those creek beds, near where South Avenue runs out toward Mariner's Harbor, that a set of human remains surfaced after a hard summer rain, wrapped inside a hospital mortuary bag that had been buried just deep enough to be forgotten and not quite deep enough to stay that way. Whoever had put the body there had counted on the marsh doing the rest of the work quietly, the way it had swallowed other secrets for other people over the years. The rain had other plans. The body had been in the ground for almost exactly a year. It was so badly decomposed that the medical examiner who first reached the scene could not immediately determine whether it belonged to a man or a woman. Both hands had been removed. It took weeks and a set of dental records to answer the only question that mattered to federal investigators who had been waiting for this discovery since the previous summer. This was Dominic Napolitano, a Bonanno crime family captain known on the streets of Brooklyn as Sonny Black, and the removal of his hands was not an accident of decomposition. It was a message, delivered in the oldest language organized crime had ever spoken, aimed at anyone who might someday be tempted to make the same mistake he had made. The mistake was trust. For roughly 6 years, Sonny Black believed he had found something genuinely rare in his line of work. A loyal, capable young associate named Donnie Brasco, a jewel thief he had taken under his wing, brought into his crew, and was preparing to sponsor for full induction into the family. The friendship was, on Napolitano's side, entirely sincere. It was also, from its very first handshake, a complete fabrication. Donnie Brasco did not exist. The man wearing that name was Joseph Pistone, a Federal Bureau of Investigation special agent conducting one of the longest and deepest undercover infiltrations of the American Mafia ever attempted by the Bureau, an operation that would eventually reach into 2 states, 2 rival crime families, and the inner circle of a boss who never once suspected who he was really talking to. What happened when the truth surfaced is the story of how a man who spent his whole career enforcing absolute loyalty against other people finally discovered what it cost when the rule turned around and came for him, delivered in the end by the one friend he never thought to doubt. If you're watching this, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from today. It's one of my favorite parts of putting these stories together, and if you want more history like this delivered straight to you, go ahead and subscribe now. Back to Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and the boy who would grow up to run it. Dominic Napolitano was born on June 16th, 1930, in New York City, the grandson of immigrants from Naples. He was raised on the streets of Williamsburg, a working-class Italian-American neighborhood in Brooklyn, where the line separating ordinary street life from organized crime was thin enough that most residents didn't bother pretending it existed at all. He was born with blonde hair, an unusual trait for a family descended from southern Italy, and as he aged, the color shifted toward a gunmetal, white-silver, the kind of premature graying that ages a man faster than his years. Napolitano started dyeing it black to hide the change. The nickname that followed him for the rest of his life, Sonny Black, came directly from that small vanity, and it stuck the way nicknames only stick in neighborhoods where everybody already has one. Even as a boy, he kept pigeons on the rooftops of Williamsburg, a hobby common among working-class men in that generation of the neighborhood, and one he would carry with him, unchanged, into the very different life that followed. He came up through the standard apprenticeship of that world. Petty theft first, then gambling rackets run at the local level, gradually absorbed into more organized criminal work as he proved himself reliable. The organization he was climbing toward had existed in roughly its modern form since the early 1930s, when a wave of internal violence, remembered afterward as the Castellammare's War, reorganized New York's Italian-American underworld into 5 governing families, eventually named for the men who came to lead them: Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese. Each family answered, at least in theory, to a shared governing body called the Commission, a panel of bosses created to settle disputes over territory and leadership before they spilled into open war on the street. The families operated under a code outsiders came to know by its Sicilian name, omerta, a vow of silence so complete that a maid member could be shot in broad daylight by another maid member and still refuse, on principle, to identify his own killer to police. Advancement inside this world followed a specific and unhurried logic. An associate had to be introduced by an existing member who would vouch for him, tested over months or years on smaller jobs, and only then proposed for formal induction in a private ceremony that involved a blood oath and the burning of a saint's image in cupped hands, the inductee reciting a vow that his own flesh should burn the same way if he ever betrayed the family, a ritual meant to bind a man's loyalty to the family above his loyalty to his own blood relatives. It was, by design, a system engineered to make infiltration by outsiders essentially impossible. That confidence would prove to be the entire family's blind spot, and Napolitano's own crew, patient and disciplined as it was, would end up demonstrating exactly how. The Bonanno family itself took its name from Joseph Bonanno, one of the young capos who had emerged from the Castellamarese War with a family of his own, and by the middle of the century its interests ran through construction, garment industry rackets, gambling, loan sharking, and the movement of stolen and counterfeit goods across the city, much like its four sister families, each of which had carved out its own overlapping mix of neighborhoods, industries, and criminal specialties across New York's 5 boroughs and the surrounding suburbs. The families rarely warred with one another for long, since prolonged conflict drew exactly the kind of law enforcement scrutiny that threatened every family's business at once, a lesson the Commission existed specifically to enforce. Joseph Bonanno himself, long since pushed out of active control of the family that carried his name, eventually published his own memoir late in life, an irony that would repeat itself decades later when the man who infiltrated his former organization, and later still the very protege who ordered a murder to cover up that infiltration, each published books of their own recounting the same underworld from opposite sides of the same betrayal. For decades, the government meant to eventually break, that confidence had shown little appetite for trying. The Bureau's own founding director spent much of his tenure publicly minimizing the existence of a coordinated national crime syndicate at all, preferring to describe organized crime as a patchwork of local gambling rings rather than a structured national hierarchy, a position that left federal law enforcement with comparatively little institutional muscle for penetrating families like the one Napolitano would eventually command. A 1957 meeting of dozens of mafia figures at a home in upstate New York, broken up by suspicious state troopers who noticed an unusual number of expensive cars parked along a quiet rural road and grew curious enough to set up a checkpoint, had already forced official Washington to concede in public what street-level investigators had known for years, that the families were real, that they were organized, and that they coordinated across state lines. A congressional hearing earlier that same decade had already put some of the same faces briefly on television, testifying evasively before cameras about businesses and associations they refused to explain, but it took the upstate meeting to finally embarrass federal law enforcement into treating organized crime as a coordinated national structure rather than a series of unconnected local problems. Even so, it took the director's death and the passage of a new federal racketeering statute in 1970, championed by a law professor who had spent years arguing that prosecutors needed a tool capable of treating an entire criminal organization as a single ongoing conspiracy rather than a collection of unrelated crimes, before the Bureau's New York office began seriously exploring long-term undercover infiltration as a primary strategy rather than a last resort. The families the Bureau wanted to reach had spent 2 generations building a structure specifically designed to keep outsiders out, testing an associate for months, requiring a maid member to vouch for him with his own life, building trust through years rather than weeks. All of it existed because the families understood exactly what a determined outsider could do to them if he ever got far enough inside. What none of them had planned for was an outsider prepared to outwait the test itself for as long as it took. By the early 1970s, Napolitano had joined the crew of Michael Sabella, a soldier working his way toward permanent standing inside the Bonanno family. Napolitano's own opportunity arrived through violence that had nothing directly to do with him. In the summer of 1979, Bonanno underboss Carmine Galante, a man whose brutality had earned him the nickname the Cigar and a reputation as one of the more feared figures in the entire New York underworld, was shot to death in the courtyard of a Brooklyn restaurant, an execution widely understood at the time to have been sanctioned by the commission itself, which had grown alarmed at Galante's ambitions to seize control of the family's narcotics trafficking on his own terms without sharing the proceeds. Galante's death cracked the Bonanno leadership wide open. Sabella was demoted in the reorganization that followed, and Napolitano, capable and trusted, was promoted in his place. Made a caporegime, a captain, with his own crew and his own piece of territory to answer for. That territory was the only neighborhood he had ever really known. He ran his operation from two locations a few doors apart on Graham Avenue in Williamsburg, the Withers Italian American War Veterans Club, and, a short walk down the block, the Motion Lounge, a modest three-story nightclub on the corner of Graham and Withers Street that quickly became the true headquarters of his crew. It was, to any outsider walking past, an unremarkable neighborhood bar with a card table in the back room. To the men who understood what actually happened there, it was where new faces were tested before anyone decided they belonged, and where the crew's real business, burglary, robbery, extortion, loan sharking, truck hijacking, bookmaking, illegal casino operations, and the steady fencing of stolen property got conducted in plain sight of a street that had learned long ago not to ask questions. Investigators who studied the crew afterward considered it one of the more disciplined and successful operations the Bonanno family had running at the time, a reputation Napolitano had built the old way patiently over decades, exactly the kind of reputation that made him a natural target for whatever the federal government decided to try next. Napolitano's closest personal bond inside the organization belonged to a younger, ambitious member named Joseph Massino. Massino had grown up in Maspeth, Queens, the son of Neapolitan American parents, a boy who, by his own later account, was already a juvenile delinquent before he reached his teenage years and had dropped out of high school not long after, running away to Florida for a stretch before eventually returning to New York. He married a woman named Josephine Vitale in the late 1950s, and her brother Salvatore, known to the family as Sal, became one of Massino's earliest and most trusted criminal partners, a bond that would eventually matter as much to Massino's downfall as Napolitano's friendship with Brasco had mattered to his. Massino worked his way up through petty theft and a lunch wagon protection racket, paying dues to Rastelli's own crew in exchange for guaranteed territory where competitors were kept away, before establishing himself as a truck hijacker of real skill and, by his own later admission, after he began cooperating with the government, committing his first murder against a fellow Bonanno associate at the end of the 1960s, years before Napolitano rose to his own captaincy. By the time he crossed paths with Napolitano, the two men had built a friendship neither seemed to regard as merely professional. Napolitano also held the trust of Philip Rastelli, known as Rusty, an incarcerated Bonanno figure who assumed formal leadership of the family once the disorder following Galante's murder settled. Rastelli's imprisonment did not diminish his authority so much as complicate how it got exercised on the street, and that complication would eventually split the Bonanno family into two hostile factions, one loyal to Rastelli and the captains who spoke for him, the other aligned with a Sicilian faction led by a capo named Alphonse Indelicato, known as Sonny Red. Napolitano sided with Rastelli. So did Massino. Neither man understood yet how much blood that choice would eventually require of them, or how directly it would circle back and destroy the very thing Napolitano had spent his whole career building. None of this had reached federal law enforcement in any coherent form until the spring of 1976, the year a Federal Bureau of Investigation agent named Joseph Pistone volunteered for an undercover assignment that was originally supposed to run only 6 months. Pistone had been born in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1939, the son of a father from Calabria and a mother from Sicily, and had grown up in Paterson, New Jersey, a working class city with its own dense network of Italian American social clubs, the kind of place where a boy absorbed the rhythms of that world without ever officially belonging to it. He earned a degree in anthropology from a local state college, taught school for a year, spent 3 years working in naval intelligence, and was sworn into the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the summer of 1969. After an early assignment in Florida, he transferred to New York in 1974 to work the truck and hijacking unit, where his ability to drive heavy trucks, his fluency in Italian, and his instinctive comfort inside neighborhood bars and social clubs made him useful in ways that went beyond ordinary casework. An earlier assignment infiltrating a vehicle theft ring had already produced dozens of arrests and put his name on the radar of agents, looking for someone willing to disappear into a much longer and far more dangerous role. When the Bureau's New York office began looking for someone to penetrate the fencing networks, moving hijacked cargo through the city's organized crime families, an operation given the internal code name Sun Apple for its two simultaneous fronts in sunny Miami and the Big Apple of New York, Pistone volunteered. The identity constructed for him was Donald Brasco, called Donnie, a small-time jewel thief and burglar, a name Pistone later said he had chosen essentially at random. He spent weeks in a gemology course learning to talk convincingly about stones and settings, studied lockpicking and safe cracking, and then, in September of 1976, he stepped out of his own life and into a role that was supposed to last half a year. He haunted the bars and after-hours clubs of Little Italy and the surrounding neighborhoods night after night, waiting for an opening, testing his cover in small ways long before any mobster ever tested it for him. In one telling early exchange, a bar owner who suspected Brasco had been flirting with a mob wife challenged him on it, and Brasco corrected him coolly, insisting that the woman had approached him first, a distinction that mattered enormously inside a culture with rigid rules about respecting another man's wife. The bar owner took it as proof the newcomer understood the code, and the door opened a little wider. Pistone worked first with the Colombo family crew, running hijackings and robberies, before shifting his attention toward the Bonanno family through a soldier named Anthony Mira, absorbing the unwritten rules of that world, one small test at a time, never initiating a crime himself, only ever participating at a level convincing enough to earn trust without crossing the legal line that would have made his own conduct indefensible in court. When Miro was sent to prison on an unrelated matter, Pistone's tutelage passed to a Bonanno soldier named Benjamin Ruggiero, known as Lefty, a man whose standing inside the family reached back 3 decades and who had reportedly killed more than 24 men across his career as an enforcer. Lefty took an immediate liking to the younger man calling himself Donnie Brasco, at one point telling him in substance that he would die alongside him if it ever came to that, a declaration of loyalty that under the family's own logic carried real and literal weight. If Brasco ever let the family down, it was Lefty's own life that would answer for the introduction. Ruggiero had spent most of his adult life inside the family's orbit, a soldier rather than a captain, content with the modest but steady criminal income that came from loan sharking and gambling, rather than any ambition to rise further, and by the time Brasco arrived, he was already regarded, by friend and target alike, as one of the more seasoned and dangerous enforcers left from an earlier, harder generation of the Bonanno family. He mentored the younger man with a kind of gruff, genuine warmth, teaching him the specific vocabulary and etiquette of the life, how to sit at a card table, how to speak carefully around a telephone, how to avoid the small errors that could get a man killed long before anyone suspected him of being anything worse than careless. That arrangement was tested more than once over the years that followed. On at least one occasion, associates suspicious that Brasco might be an informant demanded he produce a criminal reference to vouch for his credentials, and for several tense hours Pistone sat at a card table while a mobster telephoned a contact in Florida to confirm his story, not knowing whether the Bureau's own advance arrangements with an informant down there had actually held. They had. Lefty introduced him through the crew of Captain Mike Sabella, and once Sabella was demoted following Galante's death, that connection carried Pistone directly into the orbit of the man who replaced him, Dominic Napolitano. It was, by Pistone's own later account, the single step that mattered most, because once Sonny Black accepted him, the rest of the crew simply followed. Napolitano was, by the description of everyone who ever worked beside him, a genuine wise guy in the old-fashioned sense, calm under pressure, capable of ordering violence without theater, and someone who valued loyalty inside his crew above almost anything else he owned. That same quality made him, in the end, precisely the kind of man a patient infiltrator could exploit, because loyalty extended in good faith is loyalty extended without suspicion. Full induction, the honor Napolitano was quietly building toward on Brasco's behalf would have meant something specific and irreversible inside that world. Formal membership in Cosa Nostra itself, a blood oath sworn before other made men, and a status that, once granted, could almost never be taken back short of the very kind of betrayal the ceremony was designed to make unthinkable. For an outsider to reach the threshold of that ceremony without ever actually crossing it, and for the men proposing him to have no idea what they were actually proposing, was precisely the nightmare the induction process existed to prevent. Not everyone in the Bonanno hierarchy extended that same faith. Joseph Massino, Napolitano's closest friend, and the man rising fastest through the family's ranks alongside him, took one look at the newcomer calling himself Donnie Brasco and decided he did not trust him. Massino kept his own crew away from Brasco entirely, instructing the men who answered to him to have nothing to do with the newcomer, a piece of caution that history would eventually reward in ways Massino could not have predicted at the time. The contrast between the two friends, one who opened his door completely and one who never let the stranger pass the threshold, would become the fault line the entire story eventually broke along. Maintaining that persona required more than nerve. Pistone carried himself as a small-time earner rather than an ambitious one, careful never to appear too eager for advancement, since overreaching was itself a common way for a genuine informant or undercover operative to draw suspicion inside a culture that valued patience above almost every other trait. He learned to speak knowledgeably about diamonds and settings, without ever sounding like a man who had studied the subject in a classroom, to handle stolen merchandise with the practiced indifference of someone who had done it many times before, and to lose at cards occasionally, since a stranger who won constantly invited exactly the kind of scrutiny his cover could not survive. Every one of these small calibrations mattered as much, over 6 years, as any single dramatic test of his loyalty. The operation's secrecy was, by design, almost absolute even within the Bureau itself. Only a small handful of agents in the New York office knew the true scope of what Pistone was doing at any given time, and the Bureau took the unusual step of erasing his name from internal personnel rolls, so that anyone calling to ask about Agent Pistone would be told, truthfully as far as the person answering the phone knew, that no one by that name currently worked there. It was a level of institutional compartmentalization the Bureau had rarely attempted before, reflecting just how aware everyone involved was of what would happen if a single careless mention of the wrong name reached the wrong ears in Little Italy. The relationship that formed between Sonny Black and the man he knew only as Donnie Brasco deepened steadily over the years that followed. Napolitano brought Brasco into the crew's core operations, fencing stolen jewelry and merchandise, arms trafficking, loan sharking collections enforced through intimidation, and the hijacking of interstate cargo shipments carrying pharmaceuticals and other high-value goods worth tens of thousands of dollars a load. Brasco stayed at Napolitano's apartment above the Motion Lounge often enough that the two men developed something close to a domestic familiarity. Late nights running into early mornings, cartoons on the television, the ordinary companionship of two men who genuinely liked each other's company and had no reason yet to suspect otherwise. Napolitano expanded his operations south in the late 1970s, taking territory in Pasco County, Florida, and eventually opening a tennis club and nightclub called the Kings Court Bottle Club in the town of Holiday, negotiated with the blessing of Tampa's Trafficante organization, which controlled organized crime's interests across much of Florida and did not welcome outside families operating on its ground without permission. King's Court became a place where visiting wise guys could gamble, move stolen property, and conduct business away from the more watchful streets of New York, its tennis courts and modest clubhouse, offering a legitimate looking front for an operation that generated steady income for Napolitano's crew, far from the jurisdiction where most of his known associates were already under federal watch. Brasco went there with Napolitano, working alongside a second undercover agent posing as an associate named Tony Rossi, the two federal operatives maintaining their own separate cover stories, even from each other in front of company, since either man breaking character even briefly around the other risked exposing them both to a room full of people who had no idea either identity was invented. Running a legitimate seeming business gave Napolitano a foothold in a second state and a second criminal economy entirely, evidence, if any were needed, of how far his ambitions extended beyond the streets of his own Brooklyn neighborhood. The two friends played tennis together at King's Court. Napolitano, a poor player but a ferocious competitor, who shouted that he was going to kill his opponent between strokes, a man who could never beat Brasco at arm wrestling fair and who once resorted to spitting in his face mid-match just to throw him off long enough to win. It was, in its own strange register, a real friendship built on an architecture that Napolitano had no way of detecting, because the entire induction process of the Mafia was designed to test loyalty, nerve, and criminal reliability over time, and Pistone possessed all three in convincing supply, precisely because supplying them convincingly was his job. The life Pistone was living on the other side of that friendship carried its own cost, one the men around him never saw. His wife, a nurse named Maggie, and their three daughters had been moved to a location far from New York for their own protection, and Pistone saw them only rarely and only under careful arrangement, missing years of ordinary family life so that Donnie Brasco could stay believable around the clock. He rarely carried a weapon or a wire during the operation's most sensitive stretches, since either one, if discovered, would have ended the operation immediately and likely ended his life along with it. And there were nights, by his own later account, when the line between the man he actually was and the man he was pretending to be grew thin enough to worry him. He kept going anyway, in part because he understood, better than almost anyone else involved, exactly how much intelligence the operation was producing the longer it continued, and in part because turning back now, with Napolitano's trust as complete as it had become, would have wasted everything already risked to build it. By the turn of the decade, the fault line running through the Bonanno family had widened into open war. Rastelli's imprisoned leadership still faced defiance from the Sicilian faction, led by Sonny Red Indelicato, joined by two allied capos, Philip Giacconi, known as Philly Lucky, and Dominic Trinchera, known as Big Trin. The three men held meaningful territory and meaningful earning power, and had made it plain they would not accept Rastelli's authority once he came home. Napolitano and Massino, working in close coordination, understood the dispute would not resolve through negotiation. In the spring of 1981, the three rebellious captains were lured to a social club in Brooklyn under the pretense of a peace meeting meant to settle the conflict. Waiting inside were armed men hidden in a closet, among them Massino himself and an associate tied to the family's Montreal faction. When Indelicato, Giaccone, and Trinchera walked through the door, the gunmen stepped out, and within moments all three men were dead, Massino personally moving to stop Indelicato from reaching the exit. A fourth man, present at the meeting, Capofrank Lino, escaped out the door in the confusion and lived to describe the killing decades later. The bodies of Giaccone and Trinchera were never recovered. Indelicato's body surfaced days afterward in a low-lying, perpetually flooded stretch of vacant lots on the Brooklyn and Queens border that local residents called the Hole. The war inside the Bonanno family was over in a single afternoon, and Massino's standing inside the organization rose accordingly, even as the killing left one dangerous loose end still walking around free. Sonny Red's murder left behind exactly that loose end, and Napolitano understood it at once. Indelicato had a son, Anthony, known as Bruno, who had not been present for his father's killing and who would, left alive, eventually come looking for whoever was responsible. Napolitano wanted the contract carried out by his own crew, and specifically by the associate he trusted most and hoped soon to sponsor for full membership, Donnie Brasco. Killing Bruno Indelicato was to be, in Napolitano's mind, the final proof that would make Brasco a made man, the culmination of everything the two of them had built together over 5 years. For federal law enforcement watching from a careful distance, it was the worst possible development. An undercover agent, years into an operation that had already produced enormous intelligence, now stood a hand's width from either committing a real murder or exposing himself by refusing outright. Pistone had managed to avoid participating in killings before, on at least one occasion with the Bureau quietly helping him stage evidence that a task had been finished by arranging for the intended target to simply vanish under a new identity rather than actually die. This time, with a living target the Bureau could not locate in time to stage anything, and no clean way to fake the outcome, his superiors judged the risk unmanageable. Pistone himself later said he had wanted to stay longer, close enough to full induction that walking away felt, in the moment, like abandoning 6 years of work one step short of its intended finish. His superiors saw a different calculation. Every additional week undercover multiplied the odds that Brasco would either be ordered to kill a man who did not deserve to die or be exposed and killed himself, and no amount of additional intelligence justified that risk any longer. The pressure was not abstract. Ruggiero himself reportedly told Brasco, in substance, that there was no longer a way around the assignment, that he would either have to carry out the killing himself or accept that his own mentor would eventually be forced to turn on him instead, a formulation that left no comfortable middle ground for a federal agent bound by law from taking a life under any circumstances. In the closing days of July 1981, after nearly 6 years undercover, the Federal Bureau of Investigation pulled Joseph Pistone out of the operation for good, ending, almost without warning to the men who had trusted him, the longest sustained deception any of them had ever lived inside. Ending Operation Donnie Brasco did not simply retire an alias. It left behind 3 men who had vouched for, trusted, and protected a federal agent for years without knowing it, and the Bureau understood immediately what that exposure meant for their safety. Special Agent Douglas Fenkel was given the job of warning them. Accounts differ slightly on the exact date of the visit, though the substance of what happened is not in dispute. Fenkel, along with fellow agents, walked into the Motion Lounge in the closing days of July 1981 and pulled Napolitano aside. They told him plainly that the man he knew as Donnie Brasco and an associate he knew as Tony Rossi were federal agents. They showed him a photograph of Pistone standing among a group of fellow Bureau personnel, proof that left no room for argument. Fenkel told him he wanted to make sure of his safety, that he was about to have a serious problem with the Bonanno family, and offered his business card, hoping Napolitano might agree to accept protection. Napolitano refused, telling Fenkel that he knew better than anyone that he couldn't take that step, but that he knew how to reach him if it came to that. It never did. Sonny Black's reaction, by every account of the people who watched him in the days that followed, was one of genuine disbelief rather than calculation. He was said to have told associates in the days afterward that he held no ill will toward the man who had deceived him, and that he had genuinely loved him like a younger brother. Napolitano's girlfriend later told Pistone directly that in the days before his death, Napolitano had said much the same thing to her privately, that he understood Brasco had only been doing his job, and that if anyone was going to be the one to finally expose him, he was almost glad it had been someone he respected as much as he had respected Brasco. He had built a 5-year friendship with a man he considered not just reliable but genuinely likable, a man who had slept in his apartment, played tennis with him, been welcomed into his most sensitive rackets. Discovering the entire relationship had been fabricated from the first handshake was not the kind of blow a lifetime in organized crime prepares a man to absorb gracefully. Underneath the personal shock sat a colder, more immediate calculation Napolitano didn't need explained to him. In the world he had lived in his whole life, This specific offense did not require malice to be punished. It required only the fact of the breach. He had brought an undercover federal agent into his crew and nearly sponsored him for full induction into the family. Whether he had known it or not changed nothing about the damage already done. Someone would answer for that, and the men above him were not going to accept an explanation that amounted to bad luck. The man who ultimately gave the order was the friend who had always kept his distance from Brasco in the first place. Joseph Massino, whose suspicion had spared him any part in the deception, reportedly told his own brother-in-law and closest confidant that he now had to settle accounts with Napolitano over what everyone in the family had started calling the Donnie Brasco situation. The friendship that had bound the two captains through the earlier killings, the one built on Napolitano's trust in Massino as much as Massino's trust in him, did not survive the discovery. Whatever Massino felt personally about ordering the death of a man he had worked beside for years, the code both men had spent their lives enforcing left him no room to feel it out loud. It was, in its own way, the same code Napolitano had once used against Sonny Red and Delicato and his allies, now turning to consume the man who had helped enforce it. For the roughly 3 weeks between the warning and the sit-down that finally came for him, Napolitano continued to appear at the Motion Lounge, continued to run his crew's daily business, and continued, by every outward appearance, to behave like a captain with nothing weighing on him beyond the ordinary pressures of the job. Whatever conversations he had with Massino or with Rastelli's other representatives during those weeks went unrecorded, leaving no surviving account of exactly how the decision to kill him was communicated to him, or whether it was communicated at all before the morning he was finally summoned. Napolitano made no visible effort to run. He was, by the description of everyone who had worked beside him, a man of the old school, someone who understood that flight would only mark his family and associates for retribution in his place, and who accepted the code he had lived under his entire adult life, even as it turned against him personally. Federal surveillance later noted a detail that, in hindsight, reads as an unmistakable signal of what was coming. Workmen were observed dismantling the pigeon coops Napolitano kept on the roof above the Motion Lounge, the same rooftop hobby he had carried with him since boyhood, birds with pedigree bloodlines traced back to prize stock from France, Germany, and Russia, birds he had tended personally for years. Someone was already making arrangements for a world he would not be returning to. On the 17th of August, 1981, Napolitano was summoned to what the culture around him called a sit-down, a phrase that, in ordinary circumstances, meant a meeting to settle a dispute, and in his circumstances meant something closer to a verdict already decided. Before he left, he stopped at the bar below his apartment for a final drink with a bartender he trusted. He handed the man his jewelry and the keys to his apartment, with instructions to see that his pigeons were cared for. He didn't explain why, and he didn't need to. According to accounts later given by cooperating witnesses, Bonanno capo Frank Lino, the same man who had escaped the killing of the 3 rebel captains months earlier, drove Napolitano to a house on Staten Island belonging to the family of an associate, where a man named Frank Coppa was waiting to receive them. Coppa was, by that point, an established Bonanno figure in his own right, a Brooklyn-born associate who had built his own income through stock fraud schemes and various rackets across Bensonhurst and Williamsburg, and whose own path to cooperation lay more than 2 decades in the future. As Napolitano made his way toward the room where the meeting was supposedly to be held, the door was closed behind him, the prearranged signal for the men inside to act. Napolitano was shot, though not cleanly. Later testimony, taken decades afterward from Lino and Coppa themselves, once they had become cooperating witnesses, described the killing as messier than planned, the work of more than one gunman and more than one shot before it was finally finished. Coppa would later describe Napolitano's final moments simply, saying in substance that the man had died without begging, without pleading, and without giving anyone in that room the satisfaction of watching him come apart. It was, whatever else it cost him, a death that matched the discipline he had spent his whole life admiring in others. Dominic Napolitano did not surface again for almost exactly a year. The Bonanno family, understanding what his disappearance signaled, made no announcement, and for months his fate existed only as an assumption among people who understood how these things usually ended. Then, on the 12th of August, 1982, a badly decomposed body was discovered near a creek at the edge of Staten Island, close to where South Avenue meets Mariners Harbor, wrapped inside a mortuary bag that appeared to have been buried before recent heavy rain exposed it. The remains had deteriorated badly enough that a medical examiner arriving at the scene could not immediately determine whether the body was even that of a man or a woman. Both hands had been severed. Investigators eventually confirmed the identity through dental records. Within the specific grammar of mafia punishment, the removal of his hands was not incidental. It was the message. These were the hands that had reached out and welcomed an enemy into the family's inner life, and they had been taken as the price for that welcome. Bruno Indelicato, the intended target of the contract that never went forward, survived. With Pistone withdrawn before the hit could be carried out, and with Massino's own crew having kept its distance from Brasco throughout, the younger Indelicato lived to be convicted years later in a separate, sprawling prosecution known as the Mafia Commission trial. This one centered on his own role in the earlier killing of Carmine Galante, rather than on his father's death, a conviction that sent him to federal prison for decades, under a different indictment entirely, unconnected to the operation that had once marked him for a killer's bullet. The very hesitation that had made Massino suspicious of Brasco in the first place turned out, in the end, to have spared someone else's life as well as his own. The consequences of Operation Donnie Brasco did not end with Sonny Black's body in that Staten Island creek. Lefty Ruggiero, the soldier whose vouching had opened every door that mattered, was arrested by federal agents in the closing days of August 1981 on his way to a meeting with Bonanno leadership, an arrest that almost certainly saved his life, since the family's leadership had already begun treating the Brasco affair as a matter requiring blood. Ruggiero was convicted at trial the following year alongside several co-defendants and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison on racketeering conspiracy charges. Anthony Mira, the Bonanno figure who had first introduced Pistone into the world of Bonanno Associates before Ruggiero took over his sponsorship, was murdered in the middle of February 1982, found shot to death behind his own idling car in a Manhattan parking garage, another casualty of the same fallout, though the specific reasoning behind his killing was never established with the same clarity as Napolitano's. That same autumn, based directly on intelligence Pistone had gathered during his 6 years inside the family, federal prosecutors secured an indictment against half a dozen Bonanno figures, Napolitano among them, though his body had not yet been found, on racketeering and conspiracy charges tied to the killing of the 3 rebel captains, a legal document that named a dead man as a defendant because the government did not yet officially know he was dead. Pistone began testifying publicly in the summer of 1982, in the same trial where Lefty Ruggiero was forced to reckon in open court with the fact that the friend he had vouched for had been recording him the entire time. The trial itself became a minor sensation in the New York press, less for the racketeering charges at its center than for the sheer novelty of what Pistone described from the witness stand, a federal agent who had spent 6 years living, eating, and socializing inside the Mafia's daily routine, closely enough to describe its internal customs from memory, down to the specific phrases members used to signal that a room might be wired for sound. Reporters who had spent years covering organized crime, largely through court documents and the occasional informant, suddenly had access to a witness who could describe the culture from the inside with the fluency of someone who had genuinely lived it, and the resulting coverage did as much to shape the public's enduring fascination with mafia life as any single piece of fiction released around the same period. Coverage of the case arrived in a decade already fascinated with organized crime as popular entertainment, and reporters seized on the contrast between the glamorized version of that world reaching movie screens and the far more mundane, procedural reality Pistone laid out in court, a life of card games, hijacked truckloads, and long stretches of waiting, rather than the operatic violence audiences expected. Ruggiero, convicted alongside several co-defendants, absorbed his 15-year sentence with the same resigned discipline Napolitano had shown at the end, reportedly telling associates that he understood exactly why the family had to treat his role in the affair as seriously as it did, whatever affection he might still have held for the man he had vouched for. He reportedly served roughly a decade of that sentence before his release and died of cancer a few years afterward, never having reconciled, at least not publicly, with the fact that the young man he had once promised to die alongside had spent the entire friendship reporting on him to the government. Over the following years, Pistone's testimony in the intelligence gathered during his 6 years undercover contributed to more than 200 indictments and upward of 100 convictions across multiple organized crime prosecutions, including a significant role in the sprawling narcotics investigation the press came to call the Pizza Connection case, which dismantled a heroin trafficking and money laundering network that had used pizza parlors across the United States as fronts for Sicilian narcotics operations. That investigation eventually reached all the way to Gaetano Badalamenti, a former boss of the Sicilian Mafia and a central figure in the drug network, who was captured by federal and Spanish authorities in Madrid in the spring of 1984, a foreign arrest made possible in part by groundwork Pistone's undercover work had helped establish years earlier. Sammy Gravano, the Gambino underboss who would later turn government witness himself, said the embarrassment of the Donnie Brasco affair was significant enough that the leaders of New York's other crime families moved to suspend the Bonanno family from the commission altogether. A formal acknowledgement that an organization capable of missing an FBI agent, embedded at the captain level for 6 years running, had, for the moment, forfeited its standing among equals. The commission also authorized a bounty on Pistone's own life, reportedly set at $500,000, though the contract was said to have been quietly shelved by the head of the commission himself, who judged that murdering a federal agent would draw exactly the kind of national law enforcement attention no family wanted invited into its business. There was, in that calculation, an odd echo of the same discipline Napolitano had spent his career admiring. Even in fury, the men running these families understood that some acts of violence cost more than they were worth. Pistone went into hiding once his identity became public, changing his appearance and maintaining a level of personal security that would follow him for decades, his wife and daughters relocating under new names of their own. He retired from the Bureau in the mid-1980s, though he would later be called back for consulting work, lecture at the Bureau's own training academy, and eventually testify before a Senate committee as an expert on organized crime, a strange second career built entirely on the identity he had once used to deceive the very men who had trusted him. In interviews given years afterward, he remained matter-of-fact about the work itself, describing the long stretches of tedium, the card games, and the waiting, more often than the danger, as though the ordinary texture of those 6 years had left a deeper impression on him than any single close call. His memoir, written with a co-author and published in the late 1980s, became the basis for a 1997 feature film that carried the story to a much wider audience, with Johnny Depp playing Pistone, Al Pacino playing Lefty Ruggiero, and Michael Madsen playing Sonny Black. Pistone would go on to write several more books revisiting the operation from different angles over the following decades. Pistone said afterward, in substance if not in exact wording, that his intention throughout the operation had always been to see people go to prison, not to see them killed, and that he genuinely regretted what happened to Napolitano. The case also arrived at a moment when the culture of silence that had protected the 5 families for half a century was already beginning to erode from within, though few observers understood it yet. Within a decade of Napolitano's death, high-ranking members of other families, most famously Gambino underboss Sammy Gravano, would themselves begin cooperating with the government, trading testimony against their own former bosses for reduced sentences and new identities, a wave of defection that eventually did more damage to the 5 families than any single undercover infiltration ever had. The Bonanno family's own experience with Operation Donnie Brasco and the brutal internal justice it imposed on the men responsible for the breach became something of a cautionary tale told inside other families as well, an argument for tightening the rules of admission rather than an isolated embarrassment unique to one crew in Brooklyn. It would take the family itself more than 20 additional years, and a betrayal from the inside far more damaging than anything Pistone had managed, before the full reckoning finally arrived. The final chapter of the story took more than 20 years to write, and it belonged, fittingly, to the same man who had once been Sonny Black's closest friend inside the organization, Joseph Massino, who had worked alongside Napolitano to eliminate the three rebellious captains in 1981, and had then ordered Napolitano's own death months later, learned from a source with connections inside federal law enforcement that an indictment was coming for him as well, tied to the triple murder of the rebel captains. Rather than wait to be arrested, he disappeared into rural Pennsylvania under an assumed identity, staying in hiding for roughly 2 years, a period during which he was reportedly still visited by loyal associates and even by rival family figures, curious how long he could hold out. He eventually surrendered to face trial, was convicted on racketeering charges in the mid-1980s, and served roughly a decade in federal prison. It was while he was still incarcerated in the early 1990s that Rastelli died, and the family's remaining leadership named Massino as boss in his place. Upon his release the following year, Massino set about rebuilding an organization that had been in turmoil for nearly a quarter of a century, closing the family's social clubs specifically because he had learned, from watching Napolitano's downfall, how easily a fixed storefront let federal surveillance track a crew's every visitor, and running his business instead out of a Queens restaurant he owned. By the turn of the millennium, he was widely regarded as the most powerful mafia boss in the country, a distinction that earned him the nickname the Last Don, since he alone among New York's 5 family bosses was not at that moment sitting in a prison cell, and since the Bonanno family, oddly enough, had avoided the wave of 1980s prosecutions that gutted the leadership of the other 4 families precisely because it had already been humiliated and expelled from the commission over the Brasco affair, and so was never treated as a priority target in the cases that followed. Massino ran his organization with a deliberate quietness that stood in sharp contrast to some of his contemporaries in the other New York families. Just across the East River, the Gambino family was living through the opposite experiment during these same years. A flashy camera-recording boss who replaced a slain predecessor in the mid-1980s and quickly became the most photographed organized crime figure in the country, his name and face turning up in tabloids and nightly newscasts in a way no careful old-school captain would ever have permitted for himself. Massino watched that unfold from a distance and drew the opposite lesson, preferring to conduct business from a Queens restaurant he owned rather than a storefront social club or a headline-grabbing nightclub, reasoning, correctly as it turned out, that a legitimate-seeming establishment drew far less scrutiny than an obvious mob hangout or a boss who invited the cameras in himself. By his 60s, he was managing diabetes and high blood pressure, even as he continued to run an organization built on murder and extortion, a health decline that would later factor into his legal team's arguments once his own trial finally arrived. That standing did not last. In the opening days of January 2003, Massino was arrested on a sweeping racketeering indictment that included the killing of Dominic Napolitano among its charges. His own brother-in-law and longtime underboss, Salvatore Vitale, agreed to cooperate against him, eventually admitting to 11 murders of his own in exchange for a sentence of time served and a new identity in the Witness Protection Program, an outcome that would have been unthinkable inside the Bonanno family only a decade earlier, when no member of that particular family had ever broken and testified against another. Further defections followed as other Bonanno members grew afraid of being implicated in decades-old murders neither the family nor the government had ever closed the book on. Massino's own defense at trial made no attempt to deny that he had been the boss of the Bonanno family, an unusual concession in a case of this kind, arguing instead that the killings at the center of the indictment had taken place before he formally assumed leadership, and that his years running the family afterward had actually been marked by restraint, since the pace of gangland killing slowed considerably once he was in charge. The jury was unmoved. After several days of deliberation, in the summer of 2004, it convicted Massino on all counts, including the killing of the three rebel captains and the murder of the man who had once been his closest friend in the organization, and approved a $10 million forfeiture of the proceeds of his years as boss. Prosecutors had built their case in significant part on the testimony of Bonanno members who had themselves once been present in that Staten Island basement, men who finally described, decades after the fact, exactly how messy and improvised the killing had actually been, reconciling for the first time the physical evidence recovered from Napolitano's body with the far more chaotic version of events the witnesses had actually lived through and kept silent about for a quarter of a century. Immediately after the verdict was read, Massino did something no sitting boss of a New York crime family had ever done before him. He asked the presiding judge for a private meeting and offered, right there in the aftermath of his own conviction, to cooperate with the government. Facing a second, death penalty eligible indictment for an additional killing, he pleaded guilty to that murder as well and was sentenced to consecutive life terms, and only afterward did his cooperation formally begin. Years later, he took the witness stand against a former Bonanno acting boss who had succeeded him, describing under oath, in the same matter-of-fact tone that had once carried him through decades of violence, exactly what powers a mafia boss actually held: the authority to order murders, to promote and demote captains, to decide who lived inside the organization and who did not. He also described, without apparent embarrassment, the operational habit that had defined his years in charge, explaining to the jury that closing the family social clubs had made federal surveillance dramatically harder, since watching one storefront let a single agent track dozens of visitors at once, while scattering the family's business across restaurants and private meetings, forced the government to spread its resources far more thinly. His cooperation eventually earned him a reduced sentence, and by the following decade, he had been released from custody entirely under a grant of supervised release, his whereabouts undisclosed, much like the friend who had once fooled him from the inside of the very family he came to lead. The family Massino, once rebuilt, continued on without him after his cooperation became public, passing through a series of subsequent leaders and further prosecutions over the following 2 decades. A diminished version of the organization, Napolitano and Massino, had once run together, though never entirely dismantled. It survived, in other words, much the way it always had: reduced, watched, occasionally embarrassed, but never quite finished. Dominic Napolitano was buried in Calvary Cemetery in Queens, in a grave that carried none of the notoriety that would eventually attach itself to his name through Pistone's memoir and the film that followed it. What he left behind was not a legacy of institutional survival, the kind Massino would go on to build and then eventually surrender when he himself turned informant years later. What Napolitano left behind was a cautionary structure, studied afterward by every organized crime family on the East Coast, about the specific danger of trusting a man completely simply because he had proven himself reliable over years rather than months. In the operation's aftermath, New York's crime families reportedly tightened their own induction requirements, in some cases requiring a prospective soldier to take part in a killing before being made, and requiring 2 separate sponsors to vouch for him with their own lives rather than one, a direct institutional response to exactly what had happened to Sonny Black. The entire architecture of mafia induction, the waiting periods, the sponsorship requirements, the careful vetting through trusted intermediaries like Lefty Ruggiero, existed precisely to prevent what happened to Napolitano. It failed anyway, not because the process was careless, but because Joseph Pistone had understood something the process could never fully account for: that patience, applied long enough and convincingly enough, defeats almost any system built to catch an imposter in a hurry. The operation left its own mark on the government side of the story as well. Before Pistone, the Bureau had leaned overwhelmingly on informants, men already inside an organization who agreed, usually under pressure or in exchange for leniency, to report on it from within. What Pistone demonstrated was that an outsider with the right background, the right patience, and the right willingness to disappear into another identity for years at a time could produce intelligence. No informant, however well placed, could ever gather on his own, because he could be present for everything, rather than reporting on it secondhand. Long-term undercover infiltration became a standard tool in the Bureau's fight against organized crime in the years that followed, used again and again against targets far beyond the Bonanno family, a direct legacy of a technique that had never before been tested at this length or this depth, and that succeeded specifically because no one on the other side of it thought to imagine such patience was even possible. Even the film that eventually dramatized the story took liberties with it. Pistone worked as a technical advisor on the production, and he noted afterward that his own real closeness had run more directly to Napolitano than the finished film suggested, since the movie built its emotional center on the mentorship of Lefty Ruggiero rather than the deeper trust Sonny Black had actually extended. The truer betrayal, in other words, was the one the cameras spent less time on. Operation Donnie Brasco remains, decades later, one of the cases federal law enforcement returns to most, often when explaining why long-term undercover infiltration works at all, taught to new agents as a model of patience, succeeding where force and pressure had failed for generations, and studied by criminologists and journalists as one of the clearest windows ever opened onto the daily unglamorous texture of mafia life rather than its mythologized version. Beyond the 1997 film, the story has been revisited in documentary form more than once in the years since, including television series built specifically around the broader collapse of New York's organized crime families during that period, each retelling drawn back to the same central image: a federal agent sitting at a card table and a captain across from him who never once thought to doubt what he was looking at. The case outlived nearly everyone involved in it: Ruggiero's sentence, Mira's murder, Napolitano's creak, Massino's rise, and eventual collapse into cooperation, all of it folded into a single, decades-spanning story that took longer to fully resolve in a courtroom than the 6 years Pistone had originally spent living inside it. The story of Sonny Black Napolitano endures because it refuses to resolve into a simple lesson about crime and punishment. He was, by every account of the men who served under him, a capable and even likable captain, a killer who took part in the deaths of 3 rival captains without visible hesitation, and who also kept pigeons on his roof and lost arm wrestling matches to a friend he considered closer than most of his own blood relatives. That friend was never real, and the friendship, from Pistone's side, was always an instrument, however much genuine affection might have crept into it along the way. What makes the story worth remembering isn't simply that the Federal Bureau of Investigation managed to penetrate an organization built entirely around detecting exactly this kind of infiltration. It's the specific human shape the betrayal took: a man who dyed his hair black to hide his age, who ran one of the more disciplined crews in New York's underworld, who extended real trust to a stranger over 6 years, and who paid for that trust with his hands, and eventually with his life, left in a Staten Island creek for a year before the ground finally gave him back. Joseph Pistone walked away from the operation that broke the Bonanno family's standing for a generation, living out his years under an altered appearance and a price on his head that never fully expired. Dominic Napolitano did not walk away from anything. The friend who ordered his death outlived him by decades, rose to a height inside the organization that Napolitano himself never reached, and ultimately broke the same code Napolitano had died defending, trading every remaining secret he held for a chance at freedom, the same way Pistone had once traded a false identity for access. The pigeons Napolitano tended on that Brooklyn rooftop, bred from bloodlines that had crossed an ocean to reach him, outlasted the arrangements he made for their care by exactly as long as anyone bothered to keep them, which is to say, in the end, not very long at all. The Mafia's oldest rule had always run in one direction only: upward, absolute, unquestioned. Sonny Black had spent his whole career enforcing that rule against other men. In the end, it was the rule that came for him, carried by the one friend he never suspected would be the one to deliver it. In a basement he walked into believing, right up until the door closed behind him, that the two of them were still on the same side.